Out of the horrific scene inside a home in Virginia. Authorities say a former lieutenant governor shooting and killing his wife in the basement of their home and then taking his own life. Their teenage son and daughter, both home at the time. Here's Pierre Thomas now.
A teenage boy is calling 911. He's terrified. His mother is hurt. His father is somewhere inside the house. And within minutes, he will lose both of his parents. At that moment, nobody knows that. Not the dispatcher trying to understand what's happened. Not the police officers racing through the darkness. Not even the boy gripping the phone. All they know is that something has gone terribly wrong inside a quiet home in Annandale, Virginia. The dispatcher asks him to slow down, to breathe, to tell her what happened. His words come out in fragments. He thinks his father may have stabbed his mother. He isn't sure. He's scared. And he's trying to make sense of something no child should ever have to witness. Outside, flashing lights cut through the night. Police officers head toward the address expecting a domestic emergency, a possible assault, an injured woman, a family in crisis, the kind of call officers respond to every day. But this call is different, because before the night is over, investigators will find two people dead, a husband, a wife, and a family that will never be the same again. When officers enter the home, they quickly realize the situation is far worse than anyone imagined. Inside, they find Serena Fairfax, a mother, a dentist, a woman remembered by neighbors as deeply involved in her children's lives. Nearby, they find Justin Fairfax, former lieutenant governor of Virginia, a politician once viewed as one of the state's brightest rising stars. Both are dead. And according to investigators, this wasn't the work of an intruder. It wasn't a burglary. It wasn't a random act of violence. The evidence points to someone inside the home, someone the victim knew, someone the public thought they knew too. At first, the facts appear straightforward. Police would later describe the deaths as an apparent murder-suicide. But the deeper investigators looked, the less straightforward the story became. Because answering what happened turned out to be easier than answering why. How does a family that appears successful reach a moment like this? How does a man once considered a future governor end up at the center of a tragedy that leaves two children without parents? And perhaps most importantly, what was happening inside that house long before anyone called 911? As dawn breaks, news of the deaths begins spreading across Virginia, then across the country. The reaction is immediate: shock, confusion, disbelief. Many remember Justin Fairfax as the ambitious politician who rose to one of the highest offices in state government. Others remember the controversies that later surrounded his career. But regardless of how people viewed him, few expected his story to end this way. Not inside a suburban home, not during an active divorce, and certainly not with two children inside the house. That detail stays with people. Because behind the headlines are two teenagers whose lives changed forever in a matter of minutes. One of them made the call. One of them was desperately trying to get help. Neither could have imagined what police were about to find. And suddenly the story becomes bigger than politics, bigger than public office, bigger than scandal. It becomes a story about a family. A family that, from the outside, appeared to have everything. As detectives begin processing the scene, another detail catches their attention. The teenager believed his mother had been stabbed. That's what he told dispatchers. But the evidence tells a different story. Investigators quickly determined that a firearm was involved. And just like that, the first version of events begins to unravel. New questions emerge. What happened in the final moments before the shooting? Was there an argument? A confrontation? Or had the real story begun long before that night? The more investigators learned, the more they realized they weren't simply reconstructing a crime scene. They were reconstructing years of history. Years filled with events that seemed unrelated at the time. Private struggles, family disputes, court filings. Decisions that would only take on significance after everything was over. From the outside, none of it was visible. Neighbors saw a successful family. Friends saw accomplished professionals. The public saw a former lieutenant governor and a respected dentist raising two children. The image looked complete, stable, almost ideal. But images can be deceiving. And the deeper detectives dug into the Fairfax family's past, the more they uncovered a second story. A story hidden behind family photographs, campaign appearances, and public success. A story few people knew existed. And one discovery, in particular, would completely change the direction of the investigation. Because this story didn't begin with a gunshot. It didn't begin with a divorce. And it didn't begin with a 911 call. What detectives discovered next would force them to look years into the past. To understand what happened inside the Fairfax home, detectives first had to understand the family itself. Because long before courtrooms, police reports, and headlines, there was another version of this story. A much quieter one. The version captured in family photographs, school events, vacations, backyard projects, the kind of moments that rarely make the news. Looking back now, those images feel almost unsettling, not because anything appears wrong, because nothing does. The smiles look genuine, the family looks happy, the future looks secure, and that's what makes what happened later so difficult to understand. Justin and Serena Fairfax married in 2006. Over the next 2 decades, they built a life together and raised 2 children. Both were successful professionals. Justin pursued politics. Serena built a career in dentistry. From the outside, they looked like a family that had achieved the kind of life many people spend years chasing. A beautiful home, successful careers, healthy children, professional accomplishments, stability, or at least the appearance of it. As Justin's political career accelerated, so did his public profile. Supporters viewed him as one of Virginia's rising political stars, a young leader with the potential to go even further. By 2018, he had become Lieutenant Governor of Virginia. For many observers, it seemed like the beginning of something even bigger. But years later, when people reflected on the Fairfax family, many spoke less about politics and more about Serena, the mother, the constant, the person neighbors remembered seeing with the children. One neighbor later recalled watching her work on projects outside with the kids. Another remembered how involved she was in their daily lives, not because she sought attention, because she was present. The memories are ordinary, and that's exactly what makes them powerful. The tragedy would eventually become national news. But those who knew Serena remembered something much simpler: a mother raising her children, a woman planning for the future, a person living a life that appeared completely normal. At this point in the story, nothing suggests what is coming. No police investigations, no court hearings, no public warning signs. The family image remains intact. Then in 2019, everything changes. Sexual assault allegations against Justin Fairfax become national news. The accusations dominate headlines. Fairfax publicly denies them and calls for investigations into the claims. No criminal charges are filed, but the political damage is undeniable. Almost overnight, the conversation surrounding Justin Fairfax changes. The future that once appeared so certain suddenly becomes far less predictable. For the public, the controversy plays out through television interviews, newspaper articles, and political debate. But what happens inside the Fairfax home remains largely invisible. Years later, court records would provide a glimpse into that period. According to a later custody ruling, testimony presented during the proceedings suggested that the allegations had a significant impact on Fairfax. The judge would eventually write that the controversy appeared to affect both his emotional well-being and his political ambitions. At the time, however, none of that was publicly known. Most people only saw the headlines. They didn't see what was happening behind closed doors. And that distinction would become increasingly important. Because while public attention remained fixed on politics, another story was unfolding, a private one, a story that would not fully emerge until years later. As detectives eventually worked backward through the family's history, they noticed something that appears again and again in cases like this. The public version of events and the private version are not always the same. There was no indication of a crime, no evidence of violence, nothing that pointed toward the tragedy that would eventually occur. But investigators did find signs that life inside the home was becoming more complicated than it appeared from the outside. The changes were subtle, gradual, easy to miss if you weren't living through them. And for years, most people did miss them. Then investigators came across a court record that immediately stood out from everything else. An incident from 2022, one that had received little public attention at the time. But after the deaths, it became impossible to ignore. According to the court record, Justin Fairfax purchased a handgun. Sometime later, he left home carrying the firearm in a suitcase. Then he disappeared. His family became concerned. A search began. Hours passed. Nobody knew where he was or what had happened. Eventually, he was found in a wooded area near the family's home. The judge who later reviewed the incident described it as evidence that Fairfax appeared to be experiencing some type of adverse psychological event. The court did not define exactly what that meant, and investigators never publicly connected the incident to the later killings. But for detectives looking back through the timeline, the discovery changed everything. Because suddenly, the story no longer seemed to begin with a divorce, or a custody battle, or a 911 call. Now there was another question, one that reached years into the past. What exactly happened in those woods? And more importantly, was it the first warning sign that something was already beginning to unravel? That question would lead investigators deeper into the Fairfax family's history than they ever expected. And what they discovered next would be even more troubling. The question lingered. What happened in those woods? Investigators couldn't answer it with certainty. Neither could the court. The incident remained one of the most unusual discoveries in the entire timeline. A handgun, a suitcase, a disappearance, and a man later found alone in a wooded area near his home. Years before the shootings, years before the 911 call, years before anyone would begin asking how this family reached such a devastating ending. The judge who later reviewed the incident described it as evidence that Justin Fairfax appeared to be experiencing some type of adverse psychological event. But the court did not explain exactly what happened, and investigators never publicly connected the episode to the later killings. Still, after the deaths, the incident took on a new significance, because it suggested that some of the family's struggles may have begun much earlier than anyone realized. And as detectives continued working backward through the timeline, they found more. A lot more. According to court records, Justin and Serena Fairfax separated in June of 2024. Yet despite the separation, they continued living in the same home. From the outside, very little appeared to change. The address stayed the same. The family remained under one roof. But privately, the marriage was entering a very different chapter. Months later, the couple signed a post-nuptial agreement. The document was intended to establish responsibilities moving forward. But the conflict didn't disappear. Later divorce filings, Serena alleged that Justin had failed to comply with portions of the agreement. She also alleged that he was not contributing financially to support her and the children. Those claims became part of the divorce proceedings. They were allegations, not criminal findings, but they revealed tensions that had never been visible to the public. And while the legal disputes continued to grow, Serena was trying to move forward. She remained focused on the children, focused on creating stability, focused on building a future that looked increasingly different from the life she had once imagined. But the deeper investigators dug, the more private struggles began surfacing. Then they reached the custody proceedings, and suddenly, the story became much more complicated. Judge Timothy McAvoy reviewed months of testimony, evidence, and court filings. His findings offered a rare glimpse into what witnesses and family members had described behind closed doors. According to the court order, testimony suggested that Justin Fairfax had experienced significant emotional and mental health difficulties following major setbacks in his life. The order specifically referenced the public allegations that emerged in 2019 and the impact they appeared to have on him. The judge did not suggest those events caused the later tragedy, but the findings documented concerns raised during the custody proceedings, and those concerns did not stop there. Court records also described allegations of heavy alcohol use, increasing isolation, withdrawal from family life. The findings emerged through family court testimony, not a criminal investigation. But together, they painted a picture far different from the public image many people knew. The successful politician, the accomplished family man, the rising political figure. That version of Justin Fairfax still existed in public memory. The court records revealed a much more complicated reality, and investigators were still nowhere near the end of it. Because the deeper they dug, the more they realized these weren't isolated problems. They were pieces of a much larger picture. Then another issue surfaced: money. Evidence presented during the proceedings suggested that mortgage obligations had fallen into default multiple times. Other financial responsibilities had allegedly gone unmet. Again, the records did not establish motive. They did not explain what would happen later. But they added another layer to a timeline that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. By now, investigators had spent months working backward through the family's history. The picture was becoming harder to dismiss. Personal struggles, financial pressure, family conflict, legal disputes. None of it explained what happened, but all of it mattered. And investigators were about to discover something that would place them inside the home itself. Cameras. During the divorce proceedings, surveillance cameras had been installed throughout portions of the house. After the deaths, investigators reviewed footage from those devices. The recordings would later become relevant when detectives examined earlier disputes inside the home. One incident stood out. In January of 2026, Justin Fairfax contacted police and alleged that Serena had assaulted him. Authorities later stated that available evidence did not corroborate the allegation. The incident was never identified as a direct precursor to the shootings, but it lingered in the timeline. Another conflict, another police response, another moment that appeared ordinary at the time, and far more significant in hindsight, because by that point, law enforcement had already become involved in the family's conflict, and the timeline was continuing to grow. the Woods incident, the separation, the financial disputes, the custody proceedings, the alcohol concerns, the isolation, the cameras, the police contact. Each discovery raised the same question. How much pressure had been building behind closed doors? And how much of it remained invisible until after the tragedy? Detectives still didn't have an answer. What they had was context. A growing collection of warning signs that only seemed significant when viewed together. Then investigators reached a point in the timeline that stood apart from everything else. Not years before the shootings, not months before, weeks of decision. A legal ruling, one that would dramatically reshape the future of the Fairfax family. And once investigators placed that ruling into the timeline, the final weeks suddenly looked very different. Then a judge made a decision that would change everything. By the beginning of 2026, investigators would later discover that the Fairfax family was approaching a turning point. Not because of a police investigation, not because of a criminal case, because of a judge. For months, attorneys had argued over the future of the family. Court filings accumulated. Testimony was presented. Evidence was reviewed. Behind closed courtroom doors, decisions were being made that would shape the next chapter of the Fairfax family's life. And then the ruling arrived. After reviewing months of testimony and evidence, Judge Timothy McAvoy issued his decision. According to the court order, Serena Fairfax was granted primary physical custody of the couple's children. Justin Fairfax would receive visitation rights. On paper, it was a custody ruling. But for the family, it represented something much larger. The court had decided what life would look like moving forward, where the children would primarily live, who would become their primary caregiver, what the future would look like after the marriage ended. For investigators reviewing the case after the tragedy, one detail immediately stood out. The timing. The ruling came only weeks before the shootings, not because it explained what happened. It didn't. But because it marked a significant change in the family's future. For the first time, the court had formally defined what life after the divorce would look like. And the custody ruling was only the beginning. There was another condition, one that received far less public attention at the time. According to the court order, Justin Fairfax would be required to undergo alcohol testing before visits with the children. The condition emerged from concerns raised during the proceedings. Again, the requirement did not establish motive. It did not predict violence. But investigators would later view it as another important development in the final weeks before the tragedy. The future was becoming increasingly structured by court orders, and then came another decision, one that carried immediate practical consequences: housing. The court ordered Justin Fairfax to establish a separate residence. He was required to move out of the family home. Suddenly, the divorce was no longer something being discussed in court. It was about to become reality. The shared home would no longer be shared. The family would no longer live under the same roof. The arrangements everyone had spent months debating were about to take effect. And the deadline was approaching. Court records showed that the legal process was still ongoing. A show cause order required Justin Fairfax to appear before the court later that month. Additional proceedings remained unresolved. The divorce had not yet been finalized. The legal battle was still unfolding. But by now, investigators were seeing something they could not ignore. The timeline was tightening. The separation, the post-nuptial disputes, the custody proceedings, the financial allegations, the alcohol testing condition, the move-out requirement, the upcoming court appearances. Each event existed independently. Yet together, they revealed a family navigating extraordinary personal and legal pressure. Still, investigators remain careful. Conflict is not proof. Stress is not motive. Many families experience difficult divorces. Most never experience violence. That distinction remained important throughout the investigation. Because despite everything the records revealed, the central question remained unanswered. Why then? Why after years of conflict? Why not earlier? Why not later? The documents offered no definitive answer, only context, only timing. And the timing was impossible to overlook. The custody ruling, the alcohol testing requirement, the move-out order. All of it had happened within weeks of the deaths, not years, not months, weeks. Whether that timing held deeper significance is something investigators could never conclusively determine. But it ensured those final weeks would become one of the most closely examined periods in the entire case. Then the timeline narrows. Years become months, months become days, days become hours. The court proceedings continue. The future appears mapped out. Plans are in motion. And nobody realizes how little time remains. Because less than 3 weeks later, one of those children would call 911. And everything the court had spent months deciding would become irrelevant. A teenager is calling 911. His voice is shaking. And within minutes, both of his parents will be dead. He's trying to explain what happened, trying to understand it himself. He believes his father may have stabbed his mother. By now, we know things he doesn't. We know about the years of conflict, the court hearings, the custody ruling, the move-out order, the cameras, the legal battles, the warning signs investigators would later uncover. The teenager knows none of that. All he knows is that something is terribly wrong, and his mother needs help. As police race toward the house, the future of the Fairfax family has already been decided. Nobody knows it yet. Not the dispatcher, not the officers, not the children inside the home. When police arrive, they immediately realize this is not the emergency they expected. Inside the house, they find Serena Fairfax. She is dead. The teenager believed she had been stabbed. But the evidence tells a different story. Authorities find shell casings, a firearm, evidence of gunfire. Then they make a second discovery, Justin Fairfax. Dead from what investigators later determined was a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Within minutes, the nature of the case changes completely. What began as a desperate call for help becomes an apparent murder-suicide investigation. As detectives piece together the evidence, a picture begins to emerge. According to Fairfax County Police, Serena Fairfax was shot multiple times in the basement. Authorities later state there was no indication of a prolonged struggle. The violence appears to have happened quickly, very quickly. Investigators believe Justin Fairfax then moved upstairs. There, in the primary bedroom, they find him with a fatal gunshot wound. Police say the same firearm appears to have been used in both deaths. The physical evidence helps explain what happened, but it cannot explain why. The final conversation remains unknown. The final argument remains unknown. The final decision remains unknown, and perhaps it always will, because some questions survive long after an investigation ends. As news of the death spreads, the reaction is immediate. Former colleagues express shock. Political leaders release statements. Many struggle to reconcile the public figure they knew with the circumstances of his death. Others focus on Serena, the mother, the dentist. The woman neighbors remembered spending time with her children. The woman who had been preparing for a future she would never see. Friends mourn her. The community mourns her. But beneath every headline lies a quieter tragedy. 2 children have lost both parents. The custody arrangement will never take effect. The move-out order will never happen. The remaining court hearings will never be held. The future everyone spent months arguing about disappears in a single night. For many people following the case, that becomes the most heartbreaking reality of all. Not the politics, not the controversy, not even the investigation, the children. The people left behind to live with the consequences. Investigators eventually finish their work. The evidence is collected. The reports are written. The case reaches its conclusion. But some parts of the story never really end. Because long after the police leave, someone still has to live with what happened. And in this case, that burden falls on 2 teenagers. The children who lost both parents in the same night. The children who were still inside the home when everything changed. Years from now, many people will forget the court filings, the custody hearings, the political career, even the headlines. But one image remains. A teenager holding a phone in the dark, trying to explain something no child should ever have to explain, trying to save his mother, not knowing that within minutes, both of his parents would be gone. The investigations ended. The hearings ended. The headlines faded. That moment didn't.